Hey there everyone, welcome to another episode of Savor Food and Body. Today I want to start diving into some of the principles of intuitive eating. As I mentioned last week that during the month of November we're going to be talking about the principles of intuitive eating and more in depth, and also how they might relate to the holidays. And unlike the book, Intuitive Eating, and even the workbook, if you've been working through that, I'm not necessarily going to go in the same order. And that's okay. It's more related to how I see the principles show up in my work with clients. And as I work with clients, I notice that not everybody starts in the same place with practicing the principles of intuitive eating. So today, I want to start with the principle of making peace with food. And I also like to think of it as permission, allowing yourself permission with all foods. So as we dive in today, we're going to talk a little bit about the science around why restrained eating or food restriction doesn't work. And as an obvious reason, a lot of people, anyone that's been on a diet, you know that restrained eating and restriction doesn't work in the long term, and you end up with some backlash eating. So we're going to talk about that today. And we're also going to talk about what does the term habituation mean? And how does becoming habituated to certain foods, and hopefully all foods to an extent, how does that help you find peace with food? And we're going to talk about at the end some 3 tips that you can start using right away and adding to your life in order to be challenging previously forbidden foods and hopefully working towards that process of habituation with the foods. I even have a fun downloadable guide for you to work through that process with. So first of all, let's talk about the whole process of restricting or restrained eating and how that relates to backlash eating, or as some of my clients affectionately call it, is fuckit-eating, and kind of how that process works. So in the beginning, when you're on, it doesn't matter what diet you're on or what wellness plan you're on, but you have a very set list. It could be a list of foods, of what to eat, when to eat, maybe even recipe guide that goes with it. Pretty much something that you can just take to the grocery store, check all the boxes, these are the foods that you're eating, and you don't deviate from those. And that works fine and dandy in the beginning. In fact, it can feel like it's a relief. You don't have to think about what you're buying at the grocery store. You don't have to think about what you're eating at any certain meal. It's all spelled out for you. But what happens then when something in life goes haywire? So that could be an election results perhaps. It could be the holidays and being around stressful family members. It could be a pandemic perchance. It could be anything. Could even be an emotion that you're feeling or an interaction you had during your day that didn't quite set well with you. So anytime we have those little instances in our life creep in, they can really set us up for not wanting to stick with those diet food rules anymore. They can set us up for saying, like, this is a terrible idea, terrible day, interaction, whatever. I'm highly stressed out, I'm really anxious about this, and I can't do this restricted eating at the same time. So then when that happens, that's where our backlash eating. And most folks, when that happens, the first foods that they're going to go to are the foods that were previously forbidden. They were the foods on the list of said diet or wellness plan that said, avoid these foods for whatever reason. And if any of those foods were foods that you generally enjoyed, then those are going to be your first go-tos. And when you haven't had those foods for a long period of time, and it can be anywhere from days, weeks, months, really it's individual. When you first have that first bite of that food, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, this is delicious. There's also a little bit of excitement that goes along with that too, because you feel like you're getting away with something. You feel like I don't know, the diet gods aren't watching over you in that moment and you're getting away with this previously forbidden food, also called a forbidden fruit. So you may have heard that analogy of a forbidden fruit, like this is the one fruit that you cannot eat in the whole garden. And of course, anytime you tell yourself or someone else tells you you can eat anything else but this particular food, what does your brain want to do? Your brain wants to go and get some of that food and start chowing down. So after you go through that period of a long restriction, and then you finally taste that food, all bets are off in terms of how much of that food you're going to eat. And this is where we can enter into that space of feeling really chaotic with food. That particular food, you might start eating at a more rapid pace and really start checking out from your body. Because you're having this highly pleasurable experience, at least that's how it starts, and you may be trying to manage some sort of difficult emotions that are going on with you too. I'm not going to quite get into full-on emotional eating. That's another topic for another time. But there are emotions that are coming up when you're going through this cycle and you're in the space of fuckit-eating because you've been restrained eater for so long. So with that fuckit-eating, maybe you've experienced this, but that's where you're definitely going to feel more guilt and shame, both for eating the food, plus also maybe how your body looks, feels, all of the above. And so really you end up into this vicious cycle of restrained eating, aka dieting, and then an event happening or an emotion triggering that you can't handle that restraint anymore, you don't want to handle the restraint anymore, you're ready for your autonomy back. You eat a food that was previously forbidden. You get all joy, pleasure, excitement, all in the beginning, and you don't feel like that you can ever get enough of that food. And again, like I said, this is the fuckit-eating stage. Then, after having enough of the food to where maybe you even just don't physically feel well, then you start feeling judgmental and guilty towards yourself for eating that food, for breaking your rules, your diet and your food rules, and feel a lot of guilt and shame. Once we feel a lot of guilt and shame, then the cycle continues and we go, I gotta get this back under control. I have to get my eating back under control. And you start the diet all over again, or the wellness plan, or maybe you even start a new one. Maybe you say, that last one didn't work, I couldn't stick with it, so I'm gonna start something new. Doesn't really matter what flavor the restrained eating comes in, it's just the idea of it being restrained and being restrictive. So how do you break this cycle? So there's a couple of things going on, and I'll talk a little bit about the science here. So that whole process that I was describing is based on this idea called the dietary restraint theory. And it's really a theory that's at the cornerstone of intuitive eating, because I know many people, myself included, have been in that process of restrained eating, aka dieting, having a trigger happen to where we give up the dieting, we eat all the foods all the time, feel out of control, and then start guilting and shaming ourselves back into the diet again. So in a nutshell, that is the theory of restrained eating. And it sets as the cornerstone of intuitive eating because that's what intuitive eating is really trying to break. It's trying to break that cycle. So a little bit about the psychology behind why we even go down that path, why we even get into that cycle to begin with. And science has shown that if you're thinking about blowing your diet or blowing the food rules, blowing the restriction, you're more likely to eat more. So even just the thought process of I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna have a cheat day on the weekend. That thought of when I get to Saturday, who cares? I'm not gonna do my diet on the Saturday. Even that thought is gonna set you up for more fuck-it eating or being in that stage of the cycle when you do break that restraint. Research has also shown that people who eat with greater restraint are not more likely to eat less overall. So you might think, oh, so-and-so at the Thanksgiving table, like, oh, they're not touching the mashed potatoes, they're not touching the gravy, like, oh, they have so much willpower. They have so much control over their eating. Well, check in with that same individual about midnight and see how much pie they're polishing off and or whipped cream. And again, I'm not judging that eating behavior, but that eating behavior comes from the psychological and physiological process of restrained eating prior to some might even call it binge eating or overeating once that fuckit-eating starts. So additional research also shows that trying to suppress those food-related thoughts, so again, that mulling over, like, oh, I'm not going to eat this, I shouldn't eat this, or oh, I shouldn't do a cheat day, or I shouldn't have that extra piece of pie or more mashed potatoes or whatever it may be coming up in holiday meals. The more that we ruminate about that, the more likely we're also to overeat, whether it's that food or it's another food. And really, when I think about this in connection to just the idea of embodiment, so being in your physical body, getting out of your head and getting down into your body, when we're ruminating about what we should and shouldn't eat, follow the rules, break the rules, all of that back and forth, that's leaving us here in our head most of the time. And it's distracting us from being in our body. So the more that we can just to notice what messages that we're getting about food, about health, how we should be eating, not eating, maybe questioning where some of our beliefs around food come from, then we can stop this process of ruminating about what we should and shouldn't be eating. And that's also going to contribute to stopping that restrained eating, fuckit-eating cycle. So, like I said, those triggers of what could trigger that breaking that restrained eating can come from a lot of different places. Stress is a big component of that. When we're stressed, our cortisol hormones skyrocket, and that does a couple of things. One, we might be drawn to food to help manage with that stress. Again, that's another reason that we might break our restrained eating. And two, when cortisol is high, we might not have the intuitive eating cues of hunger and fullness working quite correctly. When you're stressed for whatever reason, the body's in a bit of a fight or flight stage, and it's not interested in eating and resting and digesting. So that's something to keep in mind. The other piece too, where we might be more likely to, again, break this restrained eating is because of distraction. So whether it's distraction from watching the TV, distraction from being around a stressful family member at the holidays, being distracted again helps us check out from our body. And when we're checked out from our body, we can't really be aware of those feelings, those emotions, how they're showing up in our body, and how we might be manipulating food to try to support ourselves with those emotions. So how do we stop this cycle? We stop the cycle through habituation, as I was mentioning, and there's tons of research on this as well. And the idea being that for food in particular, when you have consistent access to whatever particular previously forbidden food is, when you have continuous access to that and you allow yourself permission to eat that food, then that food stops being sexy. It stops having that allure to it, and it stops having the excitement with it when you do eat the food. So, as I was describing to a client today, the brownie ends up being just as exciting as an apple with peanut butter on it. So we often talk about morality with foods, and when we say, oh, one's healthier than the other, that in a way is kind of giving food morality. And in reality, they're both a collection of protein, fat, and carbs. So they're really neutral with each other. But if you've spent so much time restraining and restricting yourself from the brownie, when you go to have the brownie finally, again, breaking that cycle or trying to break that cycle, then, or break the restraint, I should say, then all the bells and whistles go off as you eat the brownie, and it feels exciting because you're getting away with something. You're saying screw the diet. But then eventually, again, you get to that spot where you're like, ugh, I can't eat any more brownies. This is just, I feel awful about myself and I better get myself back under control. So instead, with habituation, the idea comes from, no, the brownies, you need to have a pan of brownies there all the time. You need to know that there will always be brownies. You will always have access to brownies, not just physically by having the pan of brownies there, but knowing in your mind, the psychology piece of that you will always allow yourself permission to have the brownies. Now, this isn't talking about saying, are you hungry? Are you not hungry? Like, that's a little bit more nuanced conversation, but it's just this idea that you are mentally allowing yourself to have the brownies whenever you want them. Doesn't mean you're going to want them 24/7, although it may feel like that in the beginning, but it won't always feel like that, as long as there's always permission to have brownies, both physically, mentally, emotionally, all around, full-on permission. So as you have that full permission, you have that regular access, having those brownies just isn't, like I said, it's not as sexy anymore. It's not as exciting. It's kind of like being in a new relationship and all of a sudden that partner that you're with, your romantic partner, says, I love you for the first time. Like, all the fireworks going off, all the bells and whistles, it's so exciting. But say that relationship continues and you end up being in a long-term relationship, committed with marriage, partnership, whatever that may be, and 10 years down the road, that same individual is saying, oh, I love you, and you're like, okay, great, sweet, love you too, see you later, see you for dinner, and it's no big deal. So we can get to that same spot with food too. The only thing that stops habituation from happening is continued restraint. So if I had to think about what's one of the hardest things for folks to do as they're trying to get back to their intuitive eating skills that they were born with, it's this space of fear around, once I give myself permission for the brownies, that's all I'm ever going to want to eat. I'm going to be eating like 3 pans of brownies every single day. You might, but if you do that, if you go through that process, if you do that hard work of working to allow yourself full permission with whatever the food may be, eventually you aren't going to want brownies. You're going to want to move on to something else. You're going to want, I don't know, a pan of lasagna, or you're going to want pizza or tacos or a salad, burgers, whatever it is, bag of chips. You're going to want to move on. Your body and your mind are going to be more interested in moving on in your food choices. So that's a little bit about the restrain, fuckit-eating cycle, and how we move beyond that cycle, how we break that cycle, is by having consistent access to our forbidden foods, challenging that sexy allure of those foods, and creating the habituation with those foods. And I should also add with that, that doesn't mean that that food is going to stop tasting good to you, and meaning that once you have 5 pans of brownies or whatever, you're never going to want them again. It doesn't work that way when it comes to food. So just lean into the process and trust the idea that it's going to feel out of control of having these forbidden foods when you first start, and it's going to feel like you're eating them nonstop. But if you don't enter into that restraint phase again, you will eventually move out of that whole cycle and into feeling at peace with whatever the food is, pan of brownies or whatever. So I have 3 action steps for you to take, and hopefully this will help you make peace with foods. And I should add, like, as we're going into the holiday season, and Halloween was last week, and this can be the time of year that people really start feeling a little out of control with sweet, especially. That's kind of where it starts with Halloween candy. So that's why I wanted to offer this topic this week and kind of dive into this principle, because how cool would it be if this was the last holiday season that you felt a lot of stress and anxiety around baked goods, or any of the richer, more highly pleasurable holiday foods, whatever that may be for you and your traditions. So I want to invite you to challenge yourself, challenge the beliefs that you have around sweetness. We'll just use that as the example. And maybe even dive into challenging some of the forbidden foods that you have, so that by the time you arrive at your Thanksgiving meal or even on into your winter holiday meal, food just is food. And you can sit down and enjoy it with friends and family and embrace the conversations that you're having and move on with your holiday experience. So, and then come next year, you won't even think about it. Halloween candy will just be Halloween candy. No big deal. Okay, so action steps. I want you to make a list of your previously forbidden foods. So just in a journal, if you're a journaling person, it can even be done on a scrap piece of paper. So just jotting down a list. What are all the foods that you either deem unhealthy? And I should also add, this could be foods that maybe you eat, but you still only allow yourself a certain amount of them. Like cookies are okay, as long as you just have one or two, but more than that, and no way. Candy's okay, but you better just have a piece or two, and that's it. That's still a form of restrained eating. So add the foods to the list that maybe you still allow yourself to eat, but you don't really have full permission with them. So as you make your list, again, considering maybe some of your health, like beliefs about health and food, weight concerns, what foods are off limits because of how they might affect your weight, media messaging, family messaging around what foods are healthy, unhealthy to eat, whatnot. So those are some brainstorms to help you make your list. Now, the next list I want you to make, and this could be helpful if you make it on the same piece of paper, maybe side by side. I want you to make a list of all of the fears that you have about eating any one of those forbidden foods. So what comes up for you? Again, fears about weight changes and gaining weight, fears of being out of control with those foods and never being able to stop once you start eating them, fears of what will other people think of you if you're no longer the one having all the willpower at Thanksgiving around the mashed potatoes and the pie or whatever that may be. And as you're doing this, as you're making these two lists, it's super important to maintain self-compassion and just be open and curiosity. So not judging yourself because you have a lot or a little amount of foods on that list, not judging yourself because you are concerned about weight and you're thinking like, oh, but I'm working on intuitive eating, I'm not supposed to care about weight. Let's be honest, everybody is still concerned about weight, and that's okay. That's part of this process also. So being curious and being compassionate with yourself as you make these lists. And then the third piece is to reflect on how ready are you to make peace with, let's just say, one or two of the foods on your forbidden food list. How ready are you to make peace with those foods? So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like, yep, I'm ready, full in, let's get this party started, and 1 like, no way. That just feels way too scary. I'll be way too out of control, and that's just too much right now. Fair is fair. Again, being compassionate with yourself. Saying whether you're ready or you're not ready is just acknowledging it. There's no judgment around that. So once you have chosen a couple of foods that you like to explore making peace with, I want to invite you to download the free worksheet guide that I made to help you kind of work through this process. So on that worksheet, there'll be a place to write down what the food is, the day and time that you'd like to work with it, where you're going to eat it, so it can be helpful to do this activity in a peaceful, calming environment, and when you're mildly hungry but not ravenous, as well as mildly rested, and because being tired, all of our faculties are off when we're tired, and we're more likely to be anxious. So I want to invite you to download that guide, and I will put a link to where you can get that guide in the show notes for this. So be sure to check in the comments down below. And with that, I also want to invite you, if you want to hear more, if this episodes like this, if this is helpful information, and you want to continue learning about the principles of intuitive eating as they apply to the holiday season, stay tuned here. I invite you to even subscribe to the channel. And also by doing that, that will help other people who need to hear this information be able to find this information. And as always, you can get in touch with me at alpinenutrition.org/contact. And you can also find me in the Savor Food and Body Facebook group. It's a private Facebook group for folks working on this process and this journey of learning intuitive eating. And there's information on how to join that in the show notes as well. So with that, I will wish you a good weekend, and hopefully a peaceful weekend, and I will talk to you again soon. Take care.